Good morning and welcome into another Bible in 90 Days overview video. Believe it or not, this is our last week in the Old Testament. I bet at times during your reading it felt like we would never get here, but here we are with 1 week to go as we read through the books of Daniel and the 12 minor prophets to round out the 39 books of the Old Testament. Isn't that amazing? Y'all are so close to getting to the New Testament, and in the meantime, we have a lot of material to cover. So today I'd like to look, first of all, at the book of Daniel, and then we'll look at the 12 minor prophets thematically, so as to avoid a more tedious video of going one by one through the prophets. So we've just read the major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and then we get to the minor prophets, which is also called the book of the 12 after them, and in between we get this book of Daniel. It was sort of, I had to say, mistakenly placed here in the Christian canon, but in the Hebrew canon, the book of Daniel is placed in the writings rather than among the prophets, because the book of Daniel, more than a prophetic book, is really an apocalyptic book. It's of the same genre as the book of Revelation in the New Testament, and that's what makes the book of Daniel unique. So it doesn't really belong with the prophets, but since that is how our Christian tradition has handed it down to us, so it is that we deal with it this way now. Daniel is one of the youngest books in the Old Testament. It comes together in its final form probably in the 2nd century BC, almost getting close to the time of Christ. It's divided into two parts. The first 6 chapters contain stories, accounts, sort of legendary stories about a figure named Daniel, who is remembered for remaining faithful to the Jewish God, despite being in exile in Babylon and facing all sorts of challenges and persecutions under the foreign rulers of Babylon. Daniel 1 through 6 is familiar to many children. It contains the stories of Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, the hand writing on the wall. A lot of stories in there are common from Vacation Bible School and places like that. But very little of the book of Daniel actually appears in the preaching lectionary cycle, and so we don't often hear Daniel read and proclaimed in worship. So it's both well-known and unknown at the same time, the first 6 chapters of Daniel, which in telling their stories about the figure of Daniel, provide inspiration that God will sustain people who are under persecution and threat from foreign rulers if they remain faithful to God despite that persecution. This is often the context for apocalyptic literature, and certainly the first 6 chapters of Daniel serve that end to inspire people in the 2nd century who were being persecuted under one successive empire after another. Remember, it just sort of went from the 8th century onwards: Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. One empire after another conquered the people of Israel, and they were subject to foreign rulers instead of the Davidic line for about 6 centuries up until the time of Christ. So chapters 1 through 6 of Daniel explore the history of this legendary figure named Daniel during the Babylonian exile. Chapters 7 through 12 are all the more apocalyptic in that sort of the sense of what we get in Revelation, with lots of colorful and vivid and dramatic images. This language is code. It's code language that people in the know would understand, and together it holds out the promise of deliverance from, again, the foreign rulers under which the people lived. The promise is that God is ultimately there to restore the people to prosperity, that God is ultimately in control despite the brutish nature of those foreign rulers. Daniel's a great example of an apocalypse and the way that apocalyptic literature works. Apocalyptic literature actually, although it only has one book that represents it in both the Old and New Testaments, it was very common in between the Testaments. So there's a lot of other religious texts that are not canonical or scriptural that fit this genre of apocalypse. It uses a secret dramatic language that draws insiders into a sort of secret place within the narrative. It's almost like a secret code to those who are in the know. And it also draws on historic figures for inspiration as well to encourage people in the present time. Let me give you an example of how this might work, for example, in our own context. Let me begin to tell you an apocalypse. I had a dream, I had a vision, and in my vision I saw an island, and on that island there were lots of sharp, pointy rocks sticking out all across the island, and two rocks especially stuck out the tallest and dominated the heights of the skyline. And then I saw two birds flying near the islands, and the birds flew low and crashed into those two tallest rocks on the island, shattering them completely. But then I saw the figure of Abraham Lincoln arise from the ashes and rebuild the rock to an even taller pillar that stood even more imposing over the island. Now, if you are an American, you might understand my language to be describing the events of 9/11. That's an example of a apocalyptic event that America faced a threat from a foreign power. And as I recall this vision, everything is sort of metaphorical, but you get the metaphor because you understand American history in a way that an outsider might not get it. And so you can draw encouragement from my story that both tells a truth about the past, namely that the Twin Towers fell, but also draws on the figure of Abraham Lincoln, a national hero, to give hope to a future in which the tower is restored and restored to even greater heights. And again, that is actually what has come to pass with the new World Trade Center in New York City. So that's sort of how apocalypse works. And the book of Daniel is our Old Testament example of what an apocalypse is. So enjoy the book of Daniel. I hope the beginning of it takes you back to your childhood. By the way, the first 6 chapters of Daniel are unique in that they are written in the Aramaic language rather than in Hebrew. Only a few texts in the Old Testament are written in Aramaic, and this section of Daniel is one of the primary ones. This reflects both its later date and also the evolving language that the people spoke, moving from Hebrew and then on into Aramaic, which of course Jesus would have spoken as his native tongue. So now let's look at the minor prophets. 12 minor prophets, perfectly. It's a good number, isn't it? 12 tribes of Israel, 12 disciples in the New Testament, and sure enough, 12 minor prophets as well. I'd like to introduce them just by looking at some of the major themes that permeated the prophets, breaking down more or less into 2 time periods. First, we'll look at the pre-exilic prophets, beginning in the 8th century, but also moving on into the 7th century. These prophets were active in the northern and southern kingdoms until, of course, the northern kingdom fell. And then also some 7th century prophets who were active leading up to the time of the Babylonian exile. After we go through these themes, we'll return to the post-exilic prophets and have a look at them as well. So your 8th century prophets that are active in the north are Amos and Hosea. You've also got Micah, who's active in the south. And you've also got Nahum as well. He's a lot harder to pin down because it's so short, a lot less historic detail there. And then the 7th century prophets, Habakkuk and Zephaniah, are represented in this period of time as well. Some of the major themes in this book include the judgment of the kings who were not upholding God's covenant with the people. Many of these prophetic oracles condemn the king and almost bring up, it's called a reeve. It's a sort of prophetic dispute. It's almost a lawsuit the prophets bring on God's behalf before the king, as if to say, you have covenant obligations that you are not holding up. Many of these lawsuits, if you will, circle around the problem of idolatry, of course, which has been an issue we've seen throughout our study of the Old Testament, but many of these prophets take aim especially at the problem of idolatry, and they compare it to adultery or infidelity, especially when it's allowed to happen within God's temple. An example of this sort of condemnation is this: all her images shall be beaten to pieces, all her wages shall be burned with fire, and all her idols laid waste. From the prophet Hosea. Hosea and Micah in particular use a lot of language that compares idolatry to unfaithfulness and idol worship to prostitution. Some very harsh language used there to condemn the practice of idol worship. Another huge theme here is the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord was a future day of expectation. It's similar to what Christians expect when Christ will come again, sort of an end of time sort of deal, but certainly a strong sense of recompense and punishment associated with the day of the Lord, when God will get even with all of those who have not been faithful to God's decrees. Here's some samples of scriptures that talk about this day of the Lord from the prophet Amos 5. Alas, for you who desire the day of the Lord. Why do you want the day of the Lord? It is darkness, not light, as if someone fled from a lion and was met by a bear. Or from the prophet Zephaniah, the great day of the Lord is near, near and hastening fast. That day will be a day of wrath, a day of distress and anguish. The day of the Lord, it seems, was something that people were looking forward to because they always assumed that would be the day that God would come and destroy their enemies. But the prophets sound the alarm and say, why do you assume that God will vanquish your enemies when you yourself have positioned yourself as God's enemies because you don't uphold the covenant and you practice wickedness and refrain from righteousness? So the day of the Lord was something meant to get people's attention and implore them to get their act together before it is too late. So there are decrees throughout these prophets, not only against the foreign nations, but also against Israel and Judah and the people themselves. So there's a mixture there of decrees against other nations and also against the people of God. Another huge theme throughout these prophets is the critique of worship that doesn't also have a corresponding social righteousness with it. In other words, you go to church on Sunday and say all the right things, but then you don't obey God's will during the rest of the week. In the same way, these prophets critiqued these people for participating in very religious practice, offering sacrifices, observing festivals and feast days, but then neglecting the poor and the needy, as God has commanded them to do in the social sphere. Have a look at some of these scriptures. They sound very familiar to one another. Hosea 6:6, I desire steadfast love, not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. This is God speaking through the prophet. In Amos 5, God says, take away from me the noise of your songs. I despise your religious festivals. I will not listen to the melody of your harps, but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Micah 6:6-8, with what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, calves a year old? No, he has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? Do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. Again and again, we get this theme of the most important thing is that you treat others according to God's commands, that you care for the poor, the needy, the widow, the orphan, the stranger. And only then should you come and worship God in spirit and in truth. So this is an important theme throughout the prophets, that righteousness takes place not only in religious practices, but in the social sphere as well. And we can build on that and talk about the ways in which these twin concepts of justice and righteousness undergird so much of the prophetic critique of the people during this time. At the center of this prophetic critique is this assumption that Israel is ignoring the heart of their covenant obligations to God by ignoring justice and righteousness. Justice simply means, in the biblical sense, to be fair. Justice simply means to be fair. It often has to do with legal settings and situations. Justice is simply making fair decisions in that context. Righteousness is a little bit more of a broad term. In fact, it's so important that it has both a masculine and a feminine form in the Hebrew language. It means to be right or to be in the right. And this is not a reference to moral purity or rightness in the abstract. It has to do with being in right relationship and meeting one's obligations in a relationship, to be upholding your end of the bargain, to having your relationships with others set right. So there's at least two important implications for this word. One is that righteousness in relation to God exists if one trusts God and recognizes that one's existence is due to God's goodness. But then also it has cosmic implications as well, implications within creation itself. Righteousness is what holds the created order together. Righteousness keeps things in good order. It has to do with the earth yielding its abundance. So righteous is crucial in the very fabric of creation, not merely in one's sort of personal relationship with God, although it is, of course, crucial there as well. Amos, especially among the prophets, uses these terms justice and righteousness together and calls justice the fruit of righteousness. In other words, a right relationship with God produces justice naturally. And there's a sense throughout this prophetic material that Israel is all the more responsible than anyone else, any other people, any other tribe, for bad behavior. Israel is especially responsible because they are God's chosen people. It sort of goes back to that idea in the Torah, right? You shall be holy, for I am holy. In other words, election brings responsibility. And while it is a huge blessing to know and be in relationship with God, it also brings with it a huge responsibility on behalf of others. So those are the prophets in the 8th, 7th century leading up to the time of the exile. Those are some of their major themes. There's also a number of minor prophets who we date to the post-exilic period, after the return from exile in Babylon back to the land of Judea. These prophets, again, are Joel, Haggai, Zechariah, Obadiah, Jonah, and Malachi. Now, in the later post-exilic prophets, two groups of prophets emerged and sort of formed two primary camps with distinct and sometimes competing ideologies. And so the lines of debate among Israel were sort of drawn as they returned from exile. On the one hand, you had the pragmatic priests, who were a group of prophets who saw the temple and the maintenance of proper worship in the temple as the key to the long-term prosperity and the ongoing maintenance of the people. These prophets tend to have a more narrow and a more exclusive outlook in the way in which they viewed the people and the society. And then on the other hand, you had sort of visionary prophets who were much more concerned with the people of Judah displaying righteousness and justice. And they tended to be more universal and inclusive in their outlook. So the pragmatic priests, that first group of people, looked back to the prophet Ezekiel as their sort of founding figure. We've read through Ezekiel already, and you may remember that at the beginning of the book of Ezekiel, he articulates a vision of the glory of God departing from the temple. But then at the end of the book, his vision is of the glory of God returning to the temple. I think it's 8 chapters long there at the end of Ezekiel, this long read about a restored and a new temple in Jerusalem. And the latter chapters of Ezekiel, as you may recall, argue that no foreigners will be allowed in the temple. It notes a very strict division between the priesthood and the people and those who are worthy to set foot in the temple. Some of these pragmatic prophets would be the prophet Haggai. He's one of the prophets within this tradition. He argues that the temple itself is the key to the prosperity of the people and of God's blessing in the people's midst. And this is true also for the prophet Zechariah, too. The temple itself, the building, will lead to a prosperity of the people. So these prophets saw the people of Judah primarily as a sort of theocratic community or God-centered community that revolved around the temple and its priesthood. The religious laws were the national laws as well. The primary issue for them was holiness and their concept of what it meant to be clean over and against being unclean. The visionary prophets, on the other hand, had 3rd Isaiah, the last 10 chapters or so of the book of Isaiah, as their founding figure. From this perspective, foreigners are welcome to join in the worship of God on God's holy mountain in Zion. God's people is anyone who keeps the Sabbath. It's not so much a hereditary thing as it is a participatory thing. If you keep Sabbath, then you are the people of God. It's not about circumcision or those other markers. It's those who keep the Sabbath and who obey the laws of God. So from this perspective, there's not that same strict division between the priests and the people, but rather the priests and the Levites consist of anyone who is faithful to God, anyone who God has chosen, even those who are foreigners. For example, in the prophet Joel, who would be a part of this camp, we get this prophecy, "I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Sons and daughters shall prophesy, old and young will see visions and dream dreams." This is the great text that we get at Pentecost, right? When the Holy Spirit is poured out on all flesh. Joel is saying it's not just the priests who can prophesy or the prophets who can prophesy. It's anyone who has the Spirit of God. Think also of Jonah. Biographically, there's not much on Jonah in terms of the book that bears his name is more of a narrative about something the prophet does more than what he says. But the book as a whole demonstrates God's care for a foreign people, right? The Ninevites, Nineveh being the capital of Assyria, would have traditionally been a huge enemy of Israel. And so the book as a whole, ironically, displays God's care for even, not just foreigners, but even a foreign group that was an enemy of the people of Israel. So for these folks, God's temple was not an exclusive place for Israel, but rather it would be a house of prayer for all people. That's something, a line that Christ will quote when he turns over the temples in anger in the New Testament. God would gather others besides those who God had already chosen to be incorporated into the life of the people. The primary issues then for the visionary prophets, again, are justice and righteousness, but for the former group, it was holiness. So that's a gist of sort of the two groups, and in certain ways, they're competing voices that you get in the post-exilic minor prophets. The prophet Malachi is one person we haven't talked about yet. The last book in the Old Testament. If there is a mediating voice between these two groups, it's probably the prophet Malachi, because on the one hand, the book itself presents issues closely related to the priesthood, in accordance with the views of those pragmatic priests, the first group. In other words, Malachi calls the priests to task for not maintaining worship as they should. He also calls for holiness in worship and for the making of sacrifices. But on the other hand, Malachi also levies charges that are in accordance with the concerns of the visionary prophets too. He declares that the people are to protect the widows and the orphans, and to do justice and righteousness throughout chapters 2 and 3 there of Malachi. So Malachi is really straddling the concerns of both these groups, for both holiness on the one hand and righteousness on the other. In the end, neither side of this debate would completely win out. Both are certainly represented throughout the Old Testament canon, and both make appearances in the New Testament too. The dominant tradition, I would argue, in the New Testament is certainly that of the visionary prophets. This is where Jesus seems to get all of his ideas. But you can see the pragmatic perspective present also in places like the book of James, for example. So theologically, these two issues are important. And after all, most theology is done in the tension between two opposing perspectives. So often we want to default to one or the other, but we can't escape the various tensions that Scripture itself gives us to struggle with. So we have both the pragmatic prophets and the visionary prophets who are prophesying in the post-exilic period, and their messages don't always align perfectly, but the theology that we have is done somewhere in between the tensions that they pose. So that's a very brief overview of the book of Daniel and the minor prophets. I love the minor prophets. They're intense, but so much of what they say is so directly applicable to us today and to our society, so I think you will find them to be very engaging, despite their sort of crankiness. They clearly long for the manifestation of right relationship among God and the people, and in their calling for it, they also call us as well to pursue it in our own lives and in our own church. So I pray that your reading will be fruitful this week as we move ahead towards the end of the Old Testament. We also have another grace day between the Testaments, so if you have a chance to get caught up and finish the Old Testament, hopefully we can all start the New Testament together next week. So grace and peace to you. Thanks for tuning in and watching this overview. God bless your readings, and we will see you soon. Take care. Bye.